Hello, everybody, and welcome along. We are doing a special today because there was a series of questions that we didn't get to from viewers and listeners last time. So we're doing a bit of a recalculation of the schedule, and we'll be looking at these today for the next hour or so. So it's a bit of a off the cuff, shall we say, stream. So we will be responding to questions that are coming via email and on X or Twitter, if you prefer to be traditionalist about this. And yes, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Be here for about an hour or so. So we will begin with a question that came in from Comrade Jason, related to a recent Supreme Court case regarding gender ideology. Now, this is something, of course, we've spoken and written about before, but question reads as follows. Quote, with the Supreme Court ruling that gender is interpreted under the Equality Act based on biological sex, what are your reflections on this decision, and where does this leave the Trotskyites and wider left, given the apparent complete adherence to this ideology? Well, leaves them screaming in the wilderness and pissing in the wind, to answer Comrade Jason's question. More seriously, it leaves them looking even more ridiculous, because I was recently, as some of you may have seen, at the May Day demonstration over in Liverpool with the CPGBML comrades from the Merseyside region. Quite a number of them now. The branch there has significantly increased in size over the past year. And it was frankly somewhat embarrassing to be anywhere near that demonstration, given the number of trans rights lunatics that were on it. Now, the Trotskyites, particularly the Socialist Workers' Party, the Alliance of White Liberals, that's the AWL, if you were not familiar with them, they're a particularly vile Trotskyite sect in Britain, and others, going all in on this, because essentially what they are, especially the SWP and the AWL, are essentially transmission belts for bourgeois ideology into the what is still referred to as the labor movement. And what they have done, and we'll get to the possibilities of the state and the state forces actively encouraging gender ideology in just a moment. But let's first of all take the failures in theory of the Trotskyites seriously. So let's look at the SWP, Socialist Workers' Party. And the old joke was that it wasn't socialist, didn't have any workers in it, and wasn't much of a party. But wasn't always into stuff like gender ideology. It used to reject it. It used to either not go near it or reject it as anti-Marxist. Now, they have, even for Trotskyites, degenerated into the point where it's one of their big mobilizing points now. Now, part of that is just simple political opportunism from the Trotskyites, from the SWP, because they realized that a certain tranche of students, undergraduate students, those aged like 18 to 21, were into this due to exposure to it online. And therefore, they decided that they would go all in on it as a means of opportunistically recruiting people. So that's part of the reason why they're still all in on this and will remain so for a while to come. As long as there's a group of younger people, particularly students, who can be recruited to an organization which hysterically screams about supporting gender ideology, the SWP will continue to propagate it. So that's the first thing to say. A lot of this comes from just simple political opportunism. The SWP stopped recruiting workers quite some time ago. Their focus became as are most of the Trotskyite groups, overwhelmingly on recruiting students, and recruiting students in a very opportunistic fashion, in the sense that they don't politically develop them. They don't train them in the methods of scientific socialism. I mean, despite the fact that these people did claim at some point to be Leninists. That's what you notice about all Trotskyites. They'll all swear up and down that they're good Leninists all day, but they won't actually train their recruits into Lenin's, or should we say, the Leninist worldview. They will instead probably get them to read a few choice texts from the party leaders, and that's about it. So they're not interested in actually seriously politically educating their members. So they will recruit in an opportunistic fashion. They will try and retain these younger students in an opportunistic fashion. Because if they did seriously educate their recruits in Leninism, then there would be no way that they could actually sustain such idealist deviations. If you read something like Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, you would not be able to claim, as the SWP do, and others as well, such as so-called socialist, so-called alternative to quite what, I'm not sure. But you couldn't sustain such idealist deviations if you took Lenin's analysis in things like materialism and empirio-criticism seriously, where he eviscerates those who wander into idealist deviations, which is what gender ideology is. So lack of political training, opportunistic methods, and also, and this is a fundamental error of Trotskyism as a tendency, and it goes back to Trotsky himself, which is a very confused approach to the question of what is generally referred to as freedom, which is, again, a problematic term in some respects. But what the Trotskyites, starting from Trotsky himself, did was that they, rather than approach things in a disciplined fashion in their dispute that Trotsky had inside the CPSUB in the 1920s, they veered off into criticisms that were more and more based upon bourgeois understandings of what is generally referred to as the concept of freedom. So Trotsky starts off criticizing the majority in the CPSUB from a sort of left deviationist perspective. But into the 1930s, and this accelerates after the death of Trotsky, what you find is that Trotskyites start, first of all, in the USSR, they were in a bloc with the rights, personified by Bukharin. They were making all kinds of compromises with the rights regarding specifically the so-called lack of democracy in the Soviet Union. In reality, the Trotskyites allied with the rights against the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this, by the way, continued after the death of Trotsky, with the Trotskyites in the Western world, which is where they have the bulk of their strength. Trotskyites also present in Southern America to a degree, North Africa to a very small degree. But mostly this is a Western European movement. There are some in Eastern Europe, there are some in Russia, there were some in China, but I think they're largely sidelined and irrelevant. Mostly this is an American, US, Canadians specifically, and Western European and British tendency. And this is quite deliberate in terms of what the states and what the secret services have encouraged. But to go back to the era, the Trotskyites took a consistently anti-communist position all the way through the Cold War. Again, drawing from not just Trotsky, but people like Max Shachtman, who Americans watching will be familiar with him, the founder of many different rotten organizations that ultimately turned into the DSA in the United States. And their criticism of the Soviet Union is not a fundamentally Marxist one, because these people reject Marxism, Leninism. Their criticism of the Soviet Union and actually existing socialism comes down to echoing the propaganda of the bourgeois, meaning they will routinely say things like, the Soviet Union wasn't free. There weren't free trade unions in the Soviet Union, which is, in my view, for the flaws and the deviations of revisionism, is a ridiculous statement, given the very real power that Soviet trade unions did have for a very long time. And so the power that they had was not just related to their incorporation into the state. It was because they had a gigantic number of workers organized within them, and were still a potential source of opposition to revisionism, which is why revisionism supported free trade unions that inculcated pro-capitalist points of view in workers. That's what Solidarność did in Poland. It's what the so-called free trade unions that emerged in the late period Soviet Union and Russian Federation did. So the Trotskyites repeated the criticisms of actually existing socialism made by the imperialist states, made by the Social Democrats, made by other left anti-communists, and indeed right-wing anti-communists. So what you have is a view of freedom as a concept that the Trotskyites hold, which is fundamentally rooted in the bourgeois understanding of freedom. Now let's go back to the bourgeois understanding of what freedom is. Bourgeois understanding of freedom, coming from people like John Locke, the English philosopher, and others. You can include like most of the French Enlightenment thinkers, and you can include, to a certain extent, Thomas Paine. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was more of a radical figure, but especially the Lockean understanding of this is about non-interference with the individual by the state, and what that is rooted in is the bourgeois of Locke's time and afterwards in the 17th century, taking a stand against the power of the autocracy in England, and refusing to tolerate the interference of the autocracy of the Stuart monarchs in the private affairs of the bourgeois themselves, meaning the ability of the state to impose itself on the private property and impinge upon the private property relations cherished by the rising bourgeoisie. That's the root of the bourgeois conception of freedom. We don't want, that is, the bourgeois don't want the state to have the ability to arbitrarily confiscate property, to arbitrarily nationalize certain industries, to arbitrarily impose taxes, and also imprison bourgeois political leaders just on the whim of a king and a handful of courtiers. We want, that is, the bourgeois want a parliament that will be responsive to and representative of us, the bourgeoisie, as a class. And if a law doesn't go through that system, i.e. through representatives we have decided upon, then we will reject it. And we have the right to rebel against a system which does not give us that. That's in John Locke. It's even to a certain extent in Thomas Hobbes, who's regarded as a sort of defense of feudalism, but I think he's a little bit more interesting than that. So I make this comparison because this is where the concept of bourgeois freedom comes from, the bourgeois understanding of freedom. So the bourgeois understanding of freedom is rooted in the bourgeoisie's rejection of interference by the feudal state in their property relations, in the growing power of the system of property relations that the bourgeoisie come to personify. So this is translated into a philosophy that comes to be held up by people like J.S. Mill and other later liberal thinkers as being a system of limiting government, of individual rights of the citizen or the subject, but liberals would say the citizen, against the state. It comes out of that bourgeois concept. Now, this is where we get to the problem of like a Karl Kautsky and others who rejected the Bolshevik Revolution. Kautsky and others like him in the German SPD and their Austrian equivalents and the rest of the Second International parties, it turned out had gone through a period of prolonged ideological degeneration to the point where they couldn't recognize the fact that the class basis in the new Soviet state was fundamentally different, and that when the working class, the proletariat and peasantry, came into power through the Soviets, they needed to suppress their enemies. But of course, Kautsky, being a man who had thoroughly ingested the poison of parliamentarism, and there was others who did this as well. Like this is how the Labour Party saw it in Britain. It's how the French Socialists saw it. It's how like people like Turati in the Italian Socialist Party saw it. All of these characters and these parties had thoroughly embedded themselves in bourgeois systems and reflected bourgeois prejudices, meaning that Kautsky and others like him rejected the repression of the bourgeoisie by the dictatorship of the proletariat. They claimed, oh, it's just the dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party. It's not representative. You've suppressed the bourgeois democratic constituent assembly. You are undemocratic, etc., etc. And they thought they failed either because of a failure of analysis or just because they were simply lying by this stage. What they did not understand or were misrepresenting was the change in the nature of the ruling class in the Soviet Union. The ruling class had now become the working class and the peasantry. These were the classes that were gaining the most out of the revolution. Kautsky and co. didn't understand that. Ironically enough, Trotsky wrote a ferocious defense of the dictatorship of the proletariat in, I think it was 1919, called Terrorism and Communism. He wrote a defense of the dictatorship of the proletariat using terror against their opponents. This is at the time when he was head of the Red Army. So Trotsky himself somewhat changed his mind on this question, depending upon what was convenient for him at the time. Now later, Trotsky ends up echoing the criticisms that were raised by Kautsky, though he ties himself in knots because he tries to defend his time as head of the Red Army, which did involve violently suppressing the enemies of the revolution, with his later criticism that this had all gone wrong and how the evil Stalin was running a bureaucratic clique. So Trotsky ends up taking on these, what I would call more and more bourgeois points of view in his criticism of the Soviet Union. Now, how does this all relate to gender ideology? Now, gender ideology is like one of the logical and horrific endpoints of the development of what I would call like the bourgeois propagandistic portrayal of individual freedom in the West, particularly Britain, the USA, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Nordic countries, etc., the imperialist bloc. Because what the bourgeois do from the late 60s onwards, really, though this is a tendency which is developing from much earlier than that. But what the bourgeois do is, particularly as they take back the social democratic concessions made in the post-World War II period, what they do is in their propaganda, they lean more heavily into the idea of the West as being the center of individual freedom, of this being a place where the individual is sovereign, where the individual can do anything, where the rights of the individual are paramount. Now, this isn't true, of course, because, of course, the ruling class in the West, in the imperialist bloc, is the bourgeoisie, and so the only ones who are going to be truly free are them. But even the bourgeoisie, of course, aren't truly free under the system. The bourgeoisie often become a slave to capital accumulation. Yes, a much more well-remunerated slave than the average worker, but still enslaved by the desperate desire to grow their capital. Now, what the bourgeoisie do, though, and what their intellectuals do, is they set up this distinction between the system in the USSR, which they argue is this cruel and bureaucratic system, which is run by this horrendous group of Stalin-inspired partocrats that is trampling all over sacred individual freedoms. Now, this was bollocks, even in the revisionist period, even with all the problems that had. But what they're doing is essentially, like, they keep saying to workers in the West, and more particularly to intellectuals in the West, or the younger generation of intellectuals, that the basis for the social system, the socio-economic system in the West, is the freedom of the individual. And they don't put class distinctions on this quite deliberately. They argue that everybody is free, and that what the Western system gives you more than anything else is the ability to express yourself. Whereas they argue repeatedly, you don't get that in the USSR and the people's democracies. Again, not true, but this is what they argued. And so you then get this merging with consumerism, with what later comes to be known as like hypersexualization through the usage, particularly of women in like the advertising industry, for the mainstreaming of pornography, etc. And then later on, following the counter-revolution in the USSR, so I always say backward-looking and reactionary movements with regard to the rights of proletarian women, and a further like hypersexualization of the culture via the mainstreaming of pornographic sensibilities into Western culture. Now, all of this comes together with, as I said, a return in many respects to like the sort of a recreation on a worse level of some of the aspects of historic anti-woman prejudices that are deliberately created by the bourgeois to create a sort of perfect storm of like rotten culture, which sanctifies the idea that whatever you as an individual are feeling must be true and must be correct and has to be validated. And this is particularly sold to the intellectual caste in the West. And it's done so because this was the propaganda all the way through the Cold War, and they continue to lean into it to this day. The idea that the West means freedom to do whatever thou wilt, freedom to feel whatever you want, freedom to jerk off to whatever you want, freedom to do take as many drugs as you want, drink as much as you want, consume as much as you want. Now, they're kind of having second thoughts about that now, but it's too far gone. This has been something that they have reinforced over and over and over again. And they have presented this view of freedom in the West as something which is, if not totally detached from from wider social considerations, then near enough so totally detached. And so this is what creates the atmosphere, along with the extreme alienation of like decaying capitalism, that breeds something like gender ideology and a completely delusional point of view that an individual can change sex. They can't. No matter how early the surgical butchery is done, no matter how late it is done, no matter what amount of plastics get poured onto an individual, no matter what amount of horrific surgery is carried out, you can't change sex. It's an impossibility. But this has been sold by very cynical actors as a freedom that people now have. And it's also been sold as a solution to people's mental health problems. People who are unwell are now told by so-called psychologists that, oh, well, you're in the wrong body, which is an absolutely unscientific, completely ludicrous, cult-like point of view. but this is what is sold by academic fraudsters all the way across the West. So this leads us back to the Trotskyites, and this is my very elongated explanation as to why they won't give this up anytime soon. The Trotskyites, because they are rooted in a belief system which comes from Trotsky himself, who adopted bourgeois points of view in his attacks upon the Soviet Union and actually existing socialism, are wide open to becoming a transmission belt for bourgeois points of view into the working class. And this is what the Trotskyites in this country are. So what do they promote now? They promote a view of freedom which is completely taken from bourgeois propaganda. It is a view of freedom which, of course, basically amounts to that the individual can solve their alienation, or at least partially solve it, by surgically butchering themselves. That's what the Trotskyites hold up as sacred now. That's why they have embraced gender ideology, because they are essentially putting forward the point of view of the left end of the bourgeoisie. That's what they put forward, and it reflects in other things as well. And I'll just go into this. It reflects in other things because the SWP and the other Trotskyites put forward ideas, or slogans, I should say, such as "welfare, not warfare." I heard this chanted all the way through the weekend, just gone. Welfare, not warfare. Now, what the actual fuck does that even mean? Welfare, not warfare. I'm assuming that whoever came up with this chant just came up with it because both words begin with W. But let's unpack it and examine it. It's a terrible slogan. It's an absolutely terrible slogan, because what you essentially are advocating for there is what? More people being on welfare? Who wants to be on welfare? I've been on it a couple of times. It's absolutely fucking horrendous and demoralizing. What the SWP and those who shout that unknowingly, I think, for a lot of them, are putting forward is a view that like more workers should be essentially on stuck on the dole. Nobody wants to be stuck on the dole. You shouldn't be putting forward that as a positive thing, because it's not. Why would you want to like sit around all day desperately searching for work, or saying that you're searching for work? Why would you want to lead the life essentially of a parasite? Why would you want to put forward a slogan that encourages inertia and demoralization? Why would you do that? Firstly, because most of the people shouting that slogan haven't thought about it for more than 5 seconds. But again, let's dive a little deeper. What it actually reflects is the condition of the SWP as essentially a repository for like the ideology of the left end of the bourgeoisie and the left petty bourgeoisie, who aren't interested in the proletariat becoming the ruling class. They're not interested in the building of socialism. They're not interested in the building of working class power. What they're interested in is a return to welfare capitalism, which of course is an impossibility given the state of British, US, and Western European imperialism. But that's what the SWP and the other Trotskyites want. And so they want to return to like the days when you could live on the dole, basically, which again, no worker who has any pride wants to do that. And it's why the conservatives and the Thatcherites, etc., and the New Labour to a degree, have had success at like scoring propaganda points with workers when they make points about how they don't want everybody on the dole, they want everybody working, etc. Of course, you can't have that under capitalism, because the capitalism requires a permanent reserve army of the unemployed. But as communists, we shouldn't be going anywhere near slogans like that. Our demand must be consistently for jobs programs, for maximum employment, for like the benefits system to be there when workers are unemployed. But we should be in support of a jobs program which actually gets people into well remunerated and skilled work as often as possible. Now, that's not how capitalism uses the benefits system, nor are we in favor of like the attacks on people who have to use the benefit system because they're too sick or have life circumstances which preclude them from getting a job. We certainly shouldn't be putting things like welfare, not warfare. It's a ridiculous slogan that will not connect with the great bulk of the working class in any way whatsoever. But the SWP aren't interested in connecting with the great bulk of the working class. They're interested in connecting with the worst elements in the student population, or the most misguided elements in the student population. That's who they're interested in talking to, which is one of the same reasons why they will continue to push gender ideology. And the reason why they continue to push it is because, to reiterate my point, they are essentially just the left end of the bourgeoisie. That's where their ideas come from. That's their class point of view is left, petty bourgeois, and ultimately bourgeois. That's where the material influence on them comes from. That's where the ideology that they put forth stems from. And that's why, to answer Jason's question, they absolutely will not give it up at any point soon, unless something else comes along which enables them to recruit from the student population on the same basis that they do this. It's the same reason that they are in favor of things like so-called sex work legalization. It's the reason why you get like leftists being pro-porn and pro-prostitution, all of which I'm proud to say my own party, CPG-BML, has a very proper and thorough Marxist-Leninist critique of all of these things, and we can demonstrate how all these things originated and how all of these things are anti-working class trends. Right. Okay. So we will continue on with questions from email. So, question from Edward, who says, what are your comments on the Filipino Maoist guerrillas and the Indian Maoist guerrillas? Why can't these movements attract mass support based on the misery that exists in these places? What keeps these places, the masses passive in these places and these movements so weak? Well, I think we have to look at them slightly separately, even though they are movements, they are armies that have existed for over 50 years now. So they're clearly doing something which connects with some of the masses. My general take on Maoism, protracted People's War in this period, and this is based on my limited reading of both situations, is that the Philippines and India aren't just peasant countries anymore. Might have been true several decades ago, but India and the Philippines have very, very substantial, proletariats now. They have massive urban centers. They have a lot of industry there, especially India. And so if the idea of the Naxalites, which is who the questioner is referring to, the Indian Maoists, is that they are going to surround the cities from the countryside, I don't think that is going to work. Now, I must emphasize that I am not completely up to speed with the latest analysis of the Naxals and where they've got to in terms of their understanding of the situation in India. I will do more reading on it. But I think if their idea is that they're going to triumph by uniting the countryside and surrounding the cities, I don't think that works. It's not to say that there's not a role potentially for long-term protracted People's War in a place like India or the Philippines. It's just that this isn't China prior to 1949. These countries have significant peasantries, and that needs to be factored into revolutionary strategy. But they have also very, very significant proletariats. So I would say that an Indian revolution would need, yes, an alliance with the Indian peasantry. Absolutely, it would. But also it needs fundamentally to be led by the proletariat, given that you have an ever-growing Indian proletariat now, and you also have an ever-growing Filipino proletariat. So the idea that this was going to be won by protracted people's wars. They're based in the peasantry. I don't think that's the case anymore. Now, I could be wrong about this. If you have alternative information about the strategy of either the Indian Maoists or the Filipinos, then do be sure to send me whatever material you think I should look at, and I will reassess my judgment on this. But I think that the key to the revolution in both countries, even though they are, of course, very different, but the key to the revolution in India and the Philippines lies in the growing militancy of the proletariat and a firm and unbreakable alliance being forged between the proletariat and the peasantry in these countries. Now, that's my quick answer, because I have not read enough as of yet to satisfy myself that I know enough about the current state of play with regard to the Maoist movements in both countries. So that's my brief answer to Edward's question. I will come back to it when I have read more, though. So more on this next week. I think that's the best way I can answer that. Right, just going through any further questions here. Yes, let me go. We got a question coming on X, and this is from Nick. And this reads as follows. What do you think about the idea that the US seeks to normalize relations with Russia, lumber the EU and their favorite whipping boy, their UK poodle, with the costs of the war and reparations, and pivot militarily to Asia, leaving the Ruhr Valley metropole deindustrialized and the political architecture balkanized? Well, it's an interesting question, and it enables me to talk about a couple of things which I think needs to be considered here. First of all, through more and more research into the role that the British ruling class plays, I don't think it's correct to see the British ruling class as just simply the pet dogs of the Americans. I think it's a much more complicated relationship than that. And I think this is where we, and I include, of course, myself in this, we went wrong in our understanding of what was motivating the Iraq War. It was, and this is again a failure of the Trotskyites and the Revisionists who were dominating the anti-war movement, calling Britain just simply America's dog. I don't think the British ruling class are not just simply that. Yes, they have had to make a number of concessions to the United States ruling class since World War II, and indeed before then. And it is also the case, though, that the British ruling class, after they turned into the parasitic period of monopoly capitalism, of course, generally known as the imperialist period, started to look to the United States as being the manufacturing center and also being the source of, shall we say, the ability to enforce the will of the British ruling class, because they were finding maintaining a giant navy and army too expensive, and they wanted to continue down the route of pure parasitism and reach a point where they would get the Americans to do most of the dirty work and the donkey work for them, and they would sit back, clip their coupons, and watch the cricket. Now I've mentioned this before, but what do you think the poem "The White Man's Burden" is all about? It's not just Kipling being racist, even though of course it is. It's a call for the Americans to take over the onerous responsibilities, as the British would see it, of doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the imperialist system. And that's written at the end of the 19th century. Now, that's one of the key points of view in the British ruling class since the 1880s, 1890s, has been the idea that the US is a continuation of Britain in a new form, which comes from the way they adjusted themselves to the defeat of Britain, the British Empire in the American Revolution of 1776 to the 1780s. We will be working on a 4th of July special, by the way, so keep an eye out for that one. But the way that the British ruling class see the United States and the way that their interests have flowed and developed since World War II is that the British ruling class have, I think, pioneered a neo-colonial system which is very strong and has enabled them to stay near the top of the tree while spending an ever diminishing amount on actual warfare and doing things via manipulation of systems, manipulation of the global trading system, making sure that capital flows continue to come into the City of London, making sure that they continue to be able to get extremely advantageous terms of trade with former colonies, making sure that the former colonies remain economically and intellectually dominated by British imperialism. And this is the reason why they run one of the most extensive, like, intellectual, cultural, and educational influencing operations in the world, with more so even, I think, than the United States itself, though they're joined very much to the United States. And the aim consistently isn't just simply to be the US's tame dog, though they are obliged to follow the US if they wish to have their interests protected by US military power, but to persuade the US to do things that it might not do otherwise, or it might not do in the same way. Now, I don't want to get into the point of view of like the LaRoucheites who say that American imperialism isn't even a thing and it's all just a plot by the British monarchy. US imperialism, the US ruling class, have their distinct set of interests. They, because of the role that the US ruling class took, though, specifically and especially after World War II, where they took on the responsibility of like saving the imperial powers of Europe from potential revolution, they came to be like the leader of a collective bloc, with the British as their key partner in this, being another victory in World War II, but a much weakened one. The French, because of the slightly different relationship with the US, chafe against this periodically, but can't escape it. The British seek to influence this relationship and run it from behind the scenes wherever and whenever they can. And there is a constant push and pull between the British and the US, where you have tendencies within the US that deeply resent the British influence, and you have tendencies within Britain which still deeply resent having to play second fiddle to the Americans. But both go along with each other because their interests generally do go in the same direction. The US will periodically do over the British. So, for instance, the British aircraft manufacturing industry was basically sacrificed by the British ruling class from the 60s onwards to the interests of the US. So now, like, the British, Britain used to produce a hell of a lot of aircraft, came up with a hell of a lot of designs, and manufactured a lot of aircraft militarily and commercially, that was gradually sacrificed to US interests in particular, again from the 50s onwards. So that something like the Eurofighter, which was co-designed with the Europeans, is going to be slowly replaced by US designed aircraft. Like, British domestic production of fighter aircraft has largely been sacrificed to buy it off the US. So there's certain things which the US has basically forced the British into conceding over, and the British ruling class will concede over things like manufacturing, because that they can just buy in from the US, as long as the US continues to underpin the British ability to extract profit in a deeply parasitic way from the neo-colonial system which the British play this core role in. So take something like the Iraq War. The Iraq War wasn't just a case of the bad man George Bush and this sort of weak cuck Tony Blair going along with him. No, the Iraq War was a vital interest to the British ruling class. The ability to extract profit from a destroyed Iraq was a very big interest to them. Just as the Balkan Wars in the 90s, as we'll be covering tomorrow on the Decline and Fall episode, these were of key interests to the British ruling class. The destruction of Yugoslavia was a key interest to the British ruling class, which is why Blair was much more keen on the Kosovo War than even Clinton was. So the US and the British have distinct interests. They work together in the system that the US was the guiding force behind post-World War II. They're also in a rivalry in places like in Kenya. They're in a rivalry for influence. but they generally stick together. So the British ruling class must not be underestimated. They have declined. They are corrupt. They have sacrificed their manufacturing base. They have allowed the US to take various key manufacturing concerns away from them. But they are not to be confused with simply being servants of the US. They have their own interests. They have their own interests, which sometimes clash with the US, but they generally work out the row behind closed doors, as noted by Tony Norfield in his book on the City of London. So let's not mistake this. The British ruling class are a dangerous band of absolutely cutthroat scumbags who would murder hundreds of thousands so they could sit sipping cocktails and watching the cricket as their coupons got clipped and their profits came into through the City of London. So that's the first thing to emphasize, that this is not I do not see it as simply a poodle-like relationship. Now, in terms of the normalization of relations with Russia, again, like the US ruling class themselves are split on the issue, which is why they can't do what the more intelligent of them and far-sighted of them have wanted to do for over a decade, which is they knew very well that they were facing a problem with the Chinese really after 2008, though the relationship with China has never been as comfortable as certain analysts think that it is. There was always an underlying hostility from the US to the Chinese. I mean, bear in mind, the US and the British were very much behind the attempted counter-revolution of 1989. They were all in China. They were all on board with that. They were very much active in supporting the so-called student leaders. They smuggled some of these student leaders out of China via Hong Kong when it was still controlled by the British. So that the relationship between China, the US, and the British has never been straightforward. It's never been a case that China was a firm ally of the US, even though the Chinese revisionists did aid the US in a despicable way, it must be said, in places like Angola, in places like Afghanistan, where they were on the side of the Mujahideen and Jonas Savimbi together because they were fighting the Soviets. That was a terrible, rotten decision by the Chinese leadership, which stems from it wasn't even, you can't even purely be blamed on Deng Xiaoping. It can actually be blamed on the ludicrous ultra-left deviation that the Chinese party went through, where they and Enver Hoxha came up with the idea of social imperialism as applied to the USSR, a completely ridiculous theory, unsupported by facts, but pushed by the Maoists and the Hoxhaists to the point where, in a classic fashion, the ultra-leftist deviation in China turned into a rightist one, and they ended up supporting the same people the imperialists did in many countries for a long time. But even with that, the relationship between the Chinese and the Americans has never been as smooth as some like to portray it as being. It becomes very rough after 2008, when the US ruling class, or at least the smarter end of them, realize they're on the slide and that the Chinese are not going to just remain a repository of cheap labor, and that they're going to emerge as a technological rival, and also that the Chinese development plan, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, are actually going to start damaging the US global neocolonial system. So hence why Obama starts talking about the pivot to Asia, but they can't agree on what they and how they're going to do this. So they start talking about a pivot to Asia, but then another part of the US ruling class and the US state machine is all in on the Ukraine coup, both in 2004 and then especially 2014. Now, if you're pivoting to Asia, as Obama was talking about, why on earth are you then basically starting a war with the Russians? That doesn't make any sense. So we're not dealing with a unified ruling class here. There's different elements of it, and different elements of their intellectuals and their managers of the American state structure, which are pushing in different directions. The Obama idea, which again is cleverer than the Trump idea, is that they were going to basically pacify the Russians and promote in Russia, like so-called good relations, encourage the compradors, encourage the further integration of Russia into the European system, to neutralize Russia as a potential threat and as a potential ally for the Chinese. That's a sensible idea from the US imperialist point of view. You make sure that they don't unify. You reinforce divisions that have been there since the Sino-Soviet split. And of course, Russia remains the only power that can militarily completely destroy the United States, as in the continental United States, via the very extensive Soviet era and Russian nuclear weapon systems. So the pivot to Asia was meant to essentially make sure that the US could then increase pressure on the Chinese, meaning military pressure via the installation of more bases around China, political pressure in terms of funding and arming various different insurgencies inside Chinese territory, Xinjiang and the Uyghurs being one of these. That was the US involvement in that, I think, is very extensive, as was the Turkish involvement, by the way. Also, agitating for disruption and subversive activities in places like Hong Kong. So that was part of the plan. And also, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a big part of the plan. It was a big part of the plan because the idea was, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that you drain American capital out of China and have it go into countries in the Southeast Asian region that will be firmly allied to America. So you stop American capital going into China by giving it alternatives where it can go and make profit from the exploitation of cheap labor elsewhere. All of this falls to pieces, and it falls to pieces principally, well, partially because the Chinese managed to successfully combat the American-funded and armed insurgencies in Xinjiang and the Color Revolution attempt in Hong Kong, but also because of divisions within the US itself. Now, the TPP was killed by divisions within the US, which is expressed by Trump. Trump killed it. Obama was continuing to defend it. Now, Obama also had the idea that they were going to secure better relations with the South American nations by essentially encouraging the growth of comprador tendencies in Cuba, making some kind of peace there. Again, that was trampled all over by Trump. Again, reflecting a division within the American ruling class itself. The JCPOA in Iran was also meant to take Iran out of the game and stop an emerging alliance between Iran and China. That's completely failed, again, due to divisions within the American ruling class, because some of them are smart enough to know that they've got to concentrate on one area. Others of them, but again, that neglects that itself is a concession that they can't be enforcing their will everywhere. So the problem the American ruling class has got is that to continue to sustain their dominance, they need to be able to project power everywhere, because the global neo-colonial system that has emerged since the early 90s is based on the so-called rules-based international order, meaning that everybody has to abide by American domination over systems of international trade, enforced via IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization to a degree, even though that's rather hilariously sort of ended up with the Americans having a disagreement with their own organization now over trade rules, because of course they make the trade rules and break them all themselves all the time. But particularly, like the Americans, the US ruling class needs the ability to extract profits anywhere in the world. So it therefore needs as many countries in the world to be bound into agreements with it, and bound into having their economies essentially managed by American employed specialists that come from World Bank and IMF in particular. And the Chinese approach is slowly eroding that. And so to restore that, you need to essentially break up the Chinese approach, break up the Chinese systems, reinforce American systems. The problem that they've got is that to do that, they need to break up China's alliances, and they can't quite get themselves into a position where they can do that. So it makes sense from the point of view of the Obama administration and their part of the ruling class to take Iran off the board by doing a deal, encouraging the growth of comprador tendencies within Iran, and then further isolating China by slowly pulling Iran into the American column again. And that was never going to work because there's too many nationalistic and revolutionary forces in Iran that also favor solidarity action with groups like the Palestinian resistance movements that, of course, are contesting American colonial domination of West Asia. So not only can it not be the case that Iran gets dragged over into the American column because of the political divisions within Iran and the strength of the revolutionaries in Iran, but also that American interests in West Asia pull them in two different directions. On the one hand, they need to defend their Israeli colony that is their key asset in the region. On the other, they need to stabilize the comprador regimes in Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, Gulf states. On the other, they need to find a way to contain Iran and stop the good example that the revolution of 1979 does provide to a certain degree in terms of gaining sovereignty and independence. And they can't do all of these things. There's too many contradictions between these different elements that they need to pull together. And so this is why their policy keeps failing. It's also part of the reason why they've ended up in this confrontation with Ansar Allah, which they're losing, because it turns out American aircraft carriers weren't built to be fired upon. However, to go back to the question, and I'm aware I've talked around this for quite some time. The strategy of the Americans when it comes to Ukraine now, and this is drawing on things I said the other day, is that it's not about getting out as such. It's about hitting the pause button on the war. It's about being able to preserve the Kiev regime, even if they change the guy at the head of it. But now it looks like they're not even going to do that. The idea of Trump was that he comes in, he convinces the Russians to essentially agree to pause the war. And this is what the Kellogg plan is. It's not even Kellogg's plan. It's an idea that's been floating around think tanks in the United States for quite some time now. You convince the Russians to pause the war. You stick in a demilitarized zone. You de facto recognize you recognize Russian de facto control over the 4 regions plus Crimea. You get the Kiev regime to accept that temporarily with the secret promise that, don't worry, we'll get it back. You then get the Europeans and the British in particular not to remilitarize themselves, but to spend the years then, 3, 4, 5 years, rebuilding and remilitarizing Ukraine and incorporating what's left of Ukraine more firmly into the NATO system. And then you have another go at the Russians in 4 or 5 years' time. That, if you look at like the British plans for the rebuilding of their armed forces, a lot of the Ministry of Defence documents and the reporting on this say we'll have it right where we want it in 5 years, meaning they can't build an army that can take on the Russians in 5 years, but they can rebuild the production capacity to supply the Ukrainians in 5 years. And that's the plan. The plan is to pause what they've got now, save the Kiev regime, put in place a freeze of the conflict, and then come back to it in a few years' time. That's the plan. And the real difference with the Trump gang from the Biden gang was that the Trump gang wants to get the Europeans and the British to do the heavy lifting on this. And the dispute was really over who was going to pay for it. The Trump gang didn't want to be the primary payers of this particular bill. But now it looks like what's happened is via this minerals deal, essentially that is a justification to keep American money flowing into Ukraine and to preserve the Kiev regime. So for all Trump and Vance's theatrics towards Zelensky, the Kiev regime is going to be preserved, and the Kiev regime is going to be bolstered by additional American aid that will be committed via the justification of, these are payouts from the minerals deal. It's nothing of the sort. It's a justification for continued American involvement on a financial basis. It's something for Trump to wave to his critics domestically to say, look, I got a great deal. We got all the Ukrainian gold. Who knew there was Ukrainian gold? But I got it all. I could smell it. That's what it is. So the plan, as it turns out, was not to leave Ukraine. The plan was to reorganize the Ukraine war. And again, this was talked about in the Biden era too. It's just that the political dynamics of the Biden team meant it was going to be very hard for them to engage in any kind of negotiation with the Russians. You needed a new set of personnel to come in to sell this idea. Fortunately, the people in charge of the Putin system, the top of the Russian government, appear to have been aware of the trick that was going to be pulled on them, which is why now this negotiation is falling to pieces, because it was never a negotiation. The idea was always to freeze the conflict and save the Kiev regime and incorporate it into NATO in all but name. That was the plan. So, further to the question, then, this is, so the plan isn't, and wasn't ever to leave Europe. The plan wasn't ever really to separate the US from Europe. I have said on numerous occasions that the US cannot afford to leave Europe. There's too much money coming into and out of the US that rotates around Europe. So they're not going to abandon this. And they're going to keep on with this war because they have to. And it reflects, again, the deep problems US imperialism has, which is that they can't. The reason why they can't agree on concentrating on one particular area is because their interests are global. And if they retreat from any particular area, then that will damage them. It's why they can't retreat from Europe. They can't extricate themselves properly from Ukraine because they don't want to. The US still needs the collapse of Russia. They need that. They need that as much as the British do. The British are being especially belligerent about it because the British see in the collapse of Russia an immediate gain for themselves. The British ruling class, when it comes to China, are more conflicted, and they have been for quite some time. Some of them want to do deals with China. Some of them want to engage in like wild hostility against the Chinese, which is why you end up with Starmer and Lammy making idiots out of themselves, saying completely contradictory things in one statement about the Chinese. On Russia, though, the British ruling class is completely unified in that they want to see it destroyed so they can asset strip it. That's what they want. Everybody knows that, but they're also joined in that hostility and that need by the Germans and the French now. Now, don't mistake me, which is they're still cowards. They're still afraid of fighting the Russians directly. They're going to still try and use the poor Ukrainians as the meat in this particular grinder, which is what lies behind the whole plan. Now, I'm going to be writing more about that on the new Substack page I'm starting very soon, so keep an eye out for that. Enigmaticon says, how easy is it is for Alex to switch to Trump and then back to Alex? It's easy as just doing this. It's just so easy because all you do is I picture like Trump on a golf course doing a drive, and then maybe Trump, like, I don't know, having a Diet Coke, having an overcooked steak, and then saying, it's my friend Xi Jinping. He's a great guy, wonderful guy. Terrible country, though, awful. And then you switch back to me again. It's actually quite easy. Right. Okay, so let's. I hope that answers Nick's question, and I will elaborate further if need be. Right. So I'm going to go up through the comments in the chat. So, and I'm going to say hello to various people. So, Working Prole Incorporated, hello to you. Just another parasite who's been missing the midday streams. Well, your lucky day, mate. Nush82, greetings to you down in Melbourne, the US vassal state of Australia. Yes, election special, by the way, coming up with regard to Australia, probably Friday. Hello to Comrade Daniel. Comrade Alan out there in Oakland, California. Luxy223. Victor. Good afternoon to you. And Nush says, talking about the two-part interview with Conrad Isco-Lat. Yep, that's a good one. I recommend everybody view that one. Hello to Comrade Jawad. Exodus. Working Prole Incorporated says, the gender ideology from the West, like the other gender mental gulag, is to be fought with tooth and nails. Parasite to be purges and be lamented. Well, I'd say I'm trying to get an interview lined up with somebody to talk about gender ideology very soon. More specifically, I'm interested in talking about it from the perspective of this as a deliberately promoted thing, a deliberately promoted tendency by the ruling class, and more specifically by their intelligence services, because I think there is a real evidence emerging that they have been very much behind things like 4chan, contracted out from the US to Israel, which is again one of the roles that Israel plays. And also that I think that they've been deliberately promoting gender ideology in various different ways for the specific reasons that we've all seen it in action. So we've all seen the way it's been used to split apart movements, the way it's been used to make like Marxism become like a blue-haired joke, to destroy legitimate working class political movements and campaigns. Like the effect that it's had on like the broad left has been absolutely ruinous. So I think this is something that they have invested money into and time into and resources into promoting, just as they've invested in Trotskyism over the years. So the fact that the Trotskyites would be the ones who were pushing this the hardest is not exactly a surprise. Hello to Svetlana. Comrade, greetings to you in Moscow. Hello to Agricola Urbanus. Oh, yes, we got a Victory Day coming up very soon, so we're going to be doing something on that. Stay tuned for that one. Hello to Grassy Knoll out there in Seattle, Washington. Agricola says, or asks rather, given the latest developments in the Z colony in Malta, will the colony become a no-fly zone and the whole Mediterranean Sea a war zone? I think that this is with regard to the flotilla that was attacked by Israeli drones the other day. Yeah, I haven't caught up with the latest on this, but I saw that like Malta was refusing to allow, for a while at least, like evacuation of the people from that boat. So look, as the Zionist regime slides into an ever greater crisis, it's going to get more aggressive, and it's going to end up like in fights with more and more organizations and potentially more and more countries, so that it would get more aggressive and more desperate as its crisis continues. Is inevitability. So as for the whole Mediterranean Sea a war zone, depends how the wars develop. It's easy for the Zionist regime and the US to attack some civilian ship. Hell of a lot less easy for them to overcome Ansar Allah, which is why Trump seems to have basically waved the white flag when it comes to the Red Sea encounters. I'll have to catch up with exactly what US imperialism's plan is, because they've agreed that their own shipping isn't going to get attacked, but the Ansar Allah are still attacking Israeli shipping, and Israelis apparently weren't told that Trump was planning some big move. Now he's saying, we got a big move coming up in the Middle East. You'll all see, it's amazing. I suspect that Trump thinks he's got Saudi recognition of like Israel, which, by the way, the Saudis have done business with Israel under the table for decades. So the idea that this is new is ridiculous. What things like the Abraham Accords do is they just bring out into the open what everybody knew was there anyway. Like everybody knew for decades and decades, like the PFLP and the other Palestinian liberation groups knew damn well that the Gulf states and the Saudis were the biggest allies of US imperialism and were collaborating with the settler colony in Israel, what's referred to as Israel, occupied Palestine. So nothing new there. So I don't know what Trump thinks he's got. We'll have to wait and see. Svetlana says, 3 Chinese tank divisions are set to take part in the victory parade. That should annoy the White House. Well, excellent. The American imperialists have successfully helped in welding together the Chinese-Russian alliance. So I look forward to watching the Victory Day parade. Hello to Ben in Hungary, Robert in New York. Who else we got here? Ben, hello to you, says, I'm really frustrated with the Christian communist synthesis theory overlapping Catholicism in Europe with the worst Reich crimes. It's almost a perfect match. Croatia and Lithuania, as well as Poland, stand out. Hungary, horrible crimes, post-victory reaction as well. Can you tell me your thinking on the subjects and correlation? Yeah, I mean, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church has always been one of the most reactionary forces in the world, regardless of like whatever left position various popes have taken, like whether it's Pope John and Vatican II or the recently deceased Pope Francis. There's always been like people within Christianity who see themselves as Christian socialists and Christian communists, who draw upon, especially the New Testament, to say that the Christianity is compatible with socialism. Now, certain forms of Christianity can be, but the hierarchy of the Catholic Church very much are not. I mean, just look at the amount of crimes that, as Ben correctly says, that these people committed in Yugoslavia, in the Baltic states, in Poland, and that they continue to support to this day. Now, there are individual priests and individual Christians who are opposed to that, and some of whom, including priests, fought in the resistance movements in Eastern Europe and Western Europe in World War II. So the way I would see it is this: Christianity and Islam and Judaism and all the religions can indeed be preserved under socialism, and indeed should be. However, we as communists must be strict advocates for scientific socialism, for dialectical materialism, and for atheism. This doesn't mean that we can't work with left-wing, socialistic Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, but communist parties should remain a strictly atheistic organization. I've come to the belief now that like diluting that is a very dangerous thing to do. It's an injection of idealism, which we do not need. I'm aware that there are, like the Russian KPRF indulges the Orthodox Church. That's their decision. I think that was a mistake of revisionism, and it's a mistake to maintain it. This isn't to say that proletarians aren't going to continue to go to church or have religious beliefs. That's fine. But the communist parties should be centers of scientific progress, and a scientific socialist atheism should be definitely a core to that. And if you want to be a communist, like in a communist party, then you have to give up belief in the Almighty. Again, like religious socialists can play roles in the revolution. They can play key roles in society. They can hold key roles in government. But the Communist Party has to remain an atheistic place. And that's not a restriction of people's ability to believe, but in the end, you need to choose what you believe. What do you believe in more? The Almighty or materialism rooted in our lives here? And that's a choice individuals have to make. And this attempt to synthesize Christianity and communism, by the way, I don't think is going to work. Again, we can have coalitions with religious people, but the core of our movement has to remain atheistic. I'm just going through. Ben says, as you know, the watercolor artist's birthday was celebrated in Rome from the pulpit until 1945. And every Wehrmacht soldier had "Gott mit uns," God with us, on their belt buckle. Can't look past this. Very true. Good evening to, or good afternoon to Comrade Davey, who joins us. Why I Ain't Cool says on Twitch, which, by the way, we're live on, so make sure that you tune in over there if you possibly can. Where are we now? Yes, we are on two. We've got 148 of you watching on X, which is good. So, again, like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Just going back to the comments here. Give me a moment. Yes. Why I Ain't Cool says, great analysis, Alex. Everyone around me buys into one form or another of bourgeois propaganda. There are definitely some people are more open to new ideas, truth more than others. It will just take a fair amount of time to make a solid breakthrough. Very true. Hello to PMC Zov88, who joins us also on Twitch. Daniel says, was rewatching the life of Brian. Funny how they were joking about gender ideology on 1979. Little did they know it would become reality. Very true. Hello to Jace Hart. Working Prole says, remember first time in Austria 94 when I was searching for communist parties, some trots tried to pull me onto their side, told them to sod off. Wise decision. Burke says, can communists work with trans people who don't believe in gender ideology? That would be a minority of about 2, I think. Not numbers worthy of consideration, basically. Exeter says automation and LLMs will lead to mass unemployment, more people on welfare. Yes, the latter also leads to a perceived value of critical thinking because it is in part, if not wholly, writing based. Perceived devaluement. I would say that automation will lead to a wave of unemployment, and then it will lead to a lowering of wages, and then an employment at a lower level and a less skilled level of the people who've been displaced. That's what every single technological breakthrough has done in the West. And yes, there will remain a reserve army of unemployed. There has been for many, many decades. Even when the Labour Party in this country was talking about full employment, there was still consistently 1 million unemployed, many of whom didn't need to be. There's always a level of unemployment in the capitalist system because that's the way the capitalist system works. It's what it needs. They need that permanent army of the unemployed to act as a holding down of wages. Nush says Indian communist movement has dwindled more and more in the past 2 decades, unfortunately. I'll have to take a look at that. Jenny Hershevitz says, or asks, been listening to Andrew Feinstein launching his plea for a new left movement in opposition to what has become the Starmer-Farage Labour Party. Any thoughts? Well, I'd need to see what it means. I mean, the problem with a lot of these people, some of whom are quite honourable in their intentions, but the problem with them all is that they suffer from a fundamental delusion, and that is that at some point in the past, the Labour Party was this vehicle for the working class, or was like a vehicle for socialism, and that just isn't the case. It was always a very bourgeois party. It's always been an imperialist party. It's always been a party whose leaders have craved the embrace of imperialism and the British ruling class. So if the idea is, and this was Galloway's idea, by the way, the reason I left the WPB was because Galloway's whole idea was that we're gonna be Labour Party Mark II. Well, Labour Party Mark I was crap and led to this. And also, the other problem is that social democracy in a decaying imperialist, deindustrialized country doesn't work. Like, you now got a straight choice in Britain of, do you overthrow the parasitic ruling class, or do you continue along the lines of degeneration and demoralization of the working class? There's no reform possible. So the thing for me is like, look, various middle class leftists are going to get involved in like Feinstein's thing. They're going to get involved in various other things. Okay, whatever. I would urge them to reconsider, to read from the Marxist-Leninist tradition and to actually join the Communist Party, because the choice is either we destroy the system or it destroys us. And some kind of like left movement that sort of fiddles around the edges and tries to use parliament, we've been there before. We've been there before in the most favorable circumstances possible towards a peaceful bourgeois democratic transition to socialism. Didn't happen. It wouldn't happen this time either, because the only way forward now is if you confront the power of the British ruling class, and if you do that, then you have to move against them in a way that destroys their power, destroys their state. You can't be fiddling around the edges. It is a waste of time to do some sort of new left, united left movement, given that the basis it's going to be built on is the mythology of like what the Labour Party used to be. This is a waste of time. And I would just say to all the people who are thinking of getting involved in this, look at what you're trying to recreate. Re-examine your understanding of the Labour Party. Re-examine your understanding of the post-war consensus. Re-examine your understanding of welfare capitalism, of the nature of the British state. And you will come to the conclusion, if you do that seriously, that this thing can't be reformed, that reformism is dead and it's not coming back. And the Labour Party was always this rotten. It used to have more of a left within it. And I think a lot of these people, what they want is a Labour Party that is actually still run by right-wingers, but gives enough space for the left to mouth off in. Not going to happen. The crisis in British imperialism is too deep for them to allow that kind of level of dissent that used to be fairly common. So now it is a case where it is going to be them or us. And I choose us. I choose not to waste my time fiddling around the edges, which is what like the left, the soft left, the petty bourgeois left want to do. Nosh82 says, seems the British imperialists have more influence over the US imperialists. Well, they have a certain degree of it. Am I still streaming tonight? Yes, I will be, on a slightly separate issue. Hello to James Goblin out in Belgrade. Want some future Yugoslavia? Meme says, take back Harry and Meghan, please. No, they're yours now. And I bet you didn't keep the receipt for it either, so we definitely don't do sale or return. Daniel says, well, that's unfortunate for the British Armed Forces because it seems US aren't able to make as reliable aircraft as they used to. Indeed. Hello to Christopher Rogers, who joins us from the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China. Hello to Slumbering Colossus in Columbus, Ohio. And just going through. Slumbering Colossus enjoying the Trump impression. Good. Opinions on Ibrahim Traore. Well, as asks Evgeny Nikolaev, well, he's clearly doing some of the right things because he is getting a lot of like wild hatred from the imperialists and their apologists. Look, he's carrying on a lot of the traditions of the Sankara period and is establishing the true sovereignty and independence of Burkina Faso, bit by bit, inch by inch, taking over the gold mining industry, kicking the imperialist parasites out of the construction industry. I think what we'll do is do a whole show on him, but he's clearly taking that country in the right direction, which is why there was plots to kill him. Will you do an episode at some point or can briefly comment on the fall of Italian communism, asks Edward. I would say that the PCI and the PCF, though, although the circumstances are a little bit different in each country, Italian and French communist parties suffered a similar fate. The French Communist Party nominally still exists, but it's a fucking rotten organization now. They went down the route, they became corroded and as corroded as the old Second International parties. post-World War II concessions basically turned these two parties into parties run by parliamentary cretinists. They became reformist. I mean, I have nothing but searing contempt for people like Palmiro Togliatti and others who became the faces of reformism and revisionism in Italy. And they ended up losing the younger militant generation in Italy who joined like dead-end movements like the Red Brigades and the autonomist movement, and became enamored of the thought of like Antonio Negri, because the PCI became this sort of bureaucratic, state-bound institution, which ended up trying to sell like productivity deals to the workers in places like Fiat that were pro-capitalist. And so what you got was the route that the communist parties took, which is to go from being revolutionary organizations which had literally arms in their hands in 1945 to by the late 40s being already taken over by reformism, to by the 60s becoming out and out revisionist reformist parties. By the 80s, these rapidly become just like openly social democratic, anti-revolutionary organizations. Till by the end of the 80s, you end up with a leadership emerging in the PCI, which liquidated the thing in a deeply treacherous fashion and caused a setback in class politics in Italy from which the Italian working class has not recovered yet. So the Italian communist leaders, going all the way back to Togliatti himself, were a bunch of miserable scumbag traitors who essentially compromised and then destroyed one of the two most powerful communist parties in Europe. So they could do what? So they could participate in the farce of Italian bourgeois parliamentarism. Wow, that was worth it, wasn't it? Like, same thing with the French. Like, it's Italy and France could have seen revolutions by the early 1970s. The main reason they did not was because of the actions of the leaders of the French and Italian communist parties. And once you've gone through a revolutionary period and the communist parties have essentially blocked the revolution, which is what they did, with the support, of course, of the Soviet revisionist leaders. But this was still principally a decisions taken in Italy and France. The Soviet revisionists couldn't compel them to not pursue a revolutionary line. But this is the treachery and the rancidness of post-World War II Western European communism, which ends in Eurocommunism and liquidationism. You cease to be a revolutionary party. You cease to be a party of the militant working class. You become a revisionist party. You become a party which gets bound into agreements with the ruling class, which you take seriously, but the ruling class does not. You end up demoralizing the working and disarming the working class to the point where the party then moves into a phase of becoming alienated from the working class and then either disintegrating, which is what the PCI did, or being liquidated by its own leaders, or disintegrating, which is what the PCF did. So this is where revisionism leads to. And you wonder why, like, we reject revisionism and reformism, because it's fatal. It's been proved over and over again to be absolutely fatal. Whether it is in the Soviet Union, where revisionism and the abolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat led to the growth of, or was partly responsible for the growth of, anti-communist forces inside the party itself, and then ideologically disarming the working class to the point where the working class could not adequately mobilize and fight against these forces. And then in the West, lying to the proletariat and misguiding the proletariat about the possibilities of peaceful reform within the system. Contemptible, rotten traitors whose memories should be pissed on. All of them. Right. Hello to Irish Partisan, who's looking forward to the Yugoslav theme Decline and Fall tomorrow. Alistair Page McGill, hello to you in Prague. Matt Parker, hello to you. Irish Partisan says, strong People's Liberation Army contingent on Victory Day here in Minsk. The Tikhanovskaya camp has been having collective aneurysms over it. Well, good. Tikhanovskaya camp should all be in prison, basically. Have I seen the Oscar Romero movie starring the late Raul Julia? No, I haven't. I'll add it to my list. Have I read Shelley's The Necessity of Atheism? I actually haven't, and thank you for making the recommendation. I will go away and I will actually read that because that sounds very interesting. So, should I do an episode on the Yemeni communist history? Yes, I'll certainly be adding that to the list. Irish Partisan says Brezhnev instigated a fall when it came to the Russian Orthodox Church and Catholic churches in a bid to bring the churches online with the state. The 1977 USSR Constitution guaranteed religious freedom. Yeah, I mean, the freedom to worship should be provided. The problem is that both the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy and the Catholic hierarchy are anti-communist and weren't going to change. So allowing citizens of the Soviet Union freedom to worship is one thing. Weakening the Communist Party's understanding of the Russian Orthodox Church and its historic role, and the Catholic Church and its historic role, is the mistake. This is the thing you get with revisionism an awful lot, and I've been actually reading a lot of the Brezhnev and Khrushchev era documents. You find that what it does is it consistently tries to fudge ideological struggles. And the Brezhnev period in particular was like kind of a mess because on the one hand, there were those in the Soviet Party who were trying to develop the idea of like Soviet nationhood, and trying to find ways to counter U.S. British propaganda. And one of the ways they tried to do that was to lean into like Russian conservative traditions. This is why I say consistently Putin is a very consistent Brezhnevite cadre, as is Lavrov, as are many in the Russian system, because this is the training that they received, and this is kind of how they conduct themselves. So yes, individual citizens of the USSR, it was completely right to allow them to worship. However, it was wrong to dilute the struggle for atheism within the society and particularly within the party. So there's the mistake. Allowing individuals to worship in whatever style they choose is one thing. Allowing Russian Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism to be practiced, to say that could be combined with Marxism, Leninism, that's wrong, and only leads to confusion and outbursts of idealism. And this is where one of the reasons why revisionism has to be comprehensively critiqued and rejected is because it refuses to confront these problems in a way that, like Lenin, Stalin, and others did confront these problems repeatedly and overcame them via confrontation with them. Revisionism shirks that confrontation. All right, just scrolling through some more comments. We're going to have to draw things to a conclusion in a moment. Victor asks, how would you respond to those who try to equate communism with religion? Usually they make superficial comparisons and say that communism is a religious cult with its own saints, dogmas, rituals, etc. Yeah, it's a lazy comparison. Because what do Marxist-Leninists do with regards to our study? Is it that we see Marxism as a dry dogma to be just repeated like a catechism? Or is it that we see it as a living science which is constantly evolving? We see it as a living science which is constantly evolving and is constantly searching for greater and greater truth. And so it's not just a dead worship of idols, which is what, certainly what Christianity's become. It is at the very center of Marxism Leninism is an acknowledgement that everything is in constant motion, everything. And everything has to be constantly reassessed, and everything has to be reassessed in the light of the class struggle. Now, is it true that certain elements within the Marxist history did become dry and stilted and not based in that fundamental truth? Yes, like to a certain degree, like certain aspects of like Soviet Marxism did become like that, and that was more in the revisionist hierarchy of the Soviet leadership, where Marxism did become this dry and dry, non-dialectical thing that was divorced from the masses, which just involved leaders repeating phrases that they didn't understand. But Marxism-Leninism, if it is to be a real force within the working class, has to be based on the idea of everything constantly being in motion, or the acknowledgement of everything being constantly in motion, because the class struggle is constantly in motion. And the big problem with revisionism was that they said that the class struggle was over. And once you say that, then basically you're fucked. Then it does become, then Marxism loses its fundamental core, which is that this is a doctrine, Marxism-Leninism, which has the embrace of the class struggle as the one of the key, if not the key, motor force of history. And once you do that, then the Communist Party becomes essentially a relic. It essentially becomes something which is lost all its vital energies. Interestingly enough, like one of the things that the Andropov leadership was trying to do was trying to go back to an acknowledgement of the centrality of struggle. It was trying to do so whilst balancing many, many other different countervailing tendencies within the CPSU, and Andropov died before he could fulfill that project. But that project has been taken on by the CPC, where you don't have an acknowledgement that class struggle continues, but what you do have is the idea that struggle continues. They don't call it class struggle. They don't use the old Cultural Revolution language, but that the struggle for socialism continues, that socialism hasn't been constructed in China, that the Chinese party needs to be based on heroic, Spartan living, self-sacrificing individuals, because that struggle is something which is very much ongoing. So they have in many ways learnt from and taken up the Andropov period in China now, and Xi Jinping is doing that. The Xi Jinping leadership is doing that better than the Soviet leadership got a chance to. Okay, so. Right, so I'm running out of time because I've got to run and do something else in a minute or two. So I hope that is covered most of the questions. Any more questions that I haven't covered, either email me them in or save them for next week. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. I'll be back with you later this evening. But until then, I thank everybody who's tuned in on the various different platforms, Rumble, Locals, YouTube, Twitch, and X. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But be back with you later today, in fact. Until then, have a good rest of the day.